It was supposed to be a simple birthday, 68 candles, a small dinner, maybe a phone call from my son. But instead, I woke up to silence and a notification. There she was, my daughter-in-law Emily, smiling in front of the Eiffel Tower, her arm wrapped around her mother. The caption read, "She's the one who makes me proud." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words burned more than the candles I never lit. Because just last year, I was the one she called Mom, the one who paid for their house, their company, their start in life. But on my birthday, I was forgotten, replaced. So I smiled. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat at my old oak desk, and opened my laptop. Because if Emily thought she could humiliate me in front of the world, she was about to learn that quiet women like me don't break. We plan. And when I hit send, the transfer that would change everything, it wasn't money I moved. It was power. Stay with me. Because by the time this story ends, the woman who wanted pride will learn the true cost of it. My name is Evelyn Harris. I'm 68 years old, a retired school teacher, and a widow of nearly 12 years. I live in the same small white house where I raised my son Mark and built a quiet life with my late husband, David. These days, my mornings are slow and gentle tea by the window, the sound of sparrows, the smell of old books that still hold his handwriting in the margins. Most days feel the same. But today was supposed to be different. It was my birthday. I woke up early out of habit, the way I always did on special days. I pulled my sweater tighter around my shoulders and listened to the silence of the house. There used to be noise, David humming while he made coffee, Mark running down the hall with handmade cards and little clay gifts he'd shaped at school. The memory made me smile, but it also ached. The kind of ache that settles deep in your chest when you realize time has moved on and taken everyone with it. I decided to bake a cake. It felt silly maybe, but I didn't want the day to pass without a bit of sweetness. I'd always made my own cakes, nothing fancy, vanilla with a hint of lemon. David used to say it tasted like sunshine. I pulled out the flour, the sugar, the mixing bowl that still had a small chip on the rim from the time Mark dropped it when he was 8. I could almost hear his little voice apologizing over and over. I smiled again this time through the sting in my eyes. While the cake baked, I set the table for one, a small plate, a fork, a cup for tea. I placed a single candle in the middle of the cake when it came out of the oven, golden and warm. The smell filled the kitchen, and for a brief moment, I felt peace, like the old days had drifted back to sit beside me. I thought perhaps Mark would call. He always remembered. Even if it was late, there was usually a message, a text, something. But when I glanced at my phone, the screen was empty. No missed calls, no messages, just silence. I made my tea and carried it to the table by the window, where the morning light softened everything it touched. That was when I saw the small red dot glowing on my phone Facebook notification. I opened it without thinking, just looking for a bit of distraction. What I found instead stopped me cold. A photo filled the screen. Emily, my daughter-in-law, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, her arm wrapped around her mother's shoulder. Both of them smiling, wind in their hair, holding little cups of coffee and wearing matching scarves. The caption read, "She's the one who makes me proud." My hand trembled slightly as I scrolled through the rest. There were more photos, Paris streets, champagne glasses, designer bags, and Emily's signature hashtag, #BlessedLife. I couldn't move for a moment. My heart sank in a way that no birthday could have prepared me for. I read the caption again, slower this time, each word pressing into me like a quiet bruise. She's the one who makes me proud. It wasn't that I was jealous. I've lived enough years to know that everyone loves their mother, and that's as it should be. But there was something in those words, something sharp. Last year, on her birthday, I'd written those exact same words on a card I gave her. "You make me proud, Emily. You've made a lovely home with Mark." I remembered her smiling, hugging me, thanking me for the bracelet I'd given her. I had believed she meant it. I thought we were family. I placed the phone down and looked out the window. The sunlight danced across the fence David had built the summer before he passed. I tried to push away the heaviness rising inside me, but memories came flooding in instead. Paris. The one place David and I had dreamed of visiting, but never did. He used to keep a small travel brochure tucked inside his nightstand. One day, Evie, he'd tell me we'll walk by the Seine, drink coffee like locals, and finally see that tower with our own eyes. I never went. Life got busy. Mark's tuition, the mortgage, David's heart surgery. Paris faded into a someday that never came. And now here was Emily standing exactly where we had dreamed to be. I could almost hear David's laugh, soft and warm, reminding me not to let bitterness take root. But it wasn't bitterness, not really. It was something quieter, deeper. Disappointment, maybe. Or that strange hollow feeling you get when you realize you've been erased from someone's picture. I stood up and walked to the counter, poured myself another cup of tea, and sat down again. The house was so still I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I let the sound anchor me, keep me steady. She's the one who makes me proud. I said the words out loud, testing them as if speaking them might make them hurt less. They didn't. I thought of how many times I'd supported Mark and Emily, paying for their down payment, helping Mark start his business babysitting when they traveled. I'd done it all quietly, happily believing that kindness returned in its own way. But that morning, with that post staring back at me, I realized something kindness, without respect, turns invisible. I wasn't angry yet, just awake in a way I hadn't been for years. I turned back to my laptop. The familiar hum of the screen felt comforting, steady. I checked my bank account, not out of spite, but out of curiosity. Numbers don't lie, I thought. Maybe it was time to remember that. The clock struck 10. The candle on my cake had long since melted into a small pool of wax. I looked at it for a moment, then blew it out anyway. The smoke curled upward, twisting softly toward the ceiling. "You took her where I once dreamed to go," I whispered. My voice didn't shake. It wasn't sadness anymore, it was something else. The beginning of a decision I hadn't yet spoken aloud. I sat there for a long while after saying them, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Outside, a thin winter light stretched across the yard, touching the empty garden David once tended. I should have felt anger, but what I felt instead was an ache, a slow sinking ache that comes when something in your heart quietly breaks. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. My tea had gone cold, and the house still smelled faintly of vanilla cake. For a moment I thought about calling Mark, just to ask how they were, just to hear his voice. But I didn't. I already knew how that conversation would go, short, polite, distracted. Emily would be nearby, and he'd speak in that careful tone he used when he didn't want to upset anyone. My son was a good man, but he'd learned to keep peace at any cost, even when that peace meant leaving me out. I stared at the photo again on my phone, that single sentence burning like a small fire in my chest. She's the one who makes me proud. It was almost too familiar. My mind reached back, searching for where I'd heard it before, and then it came to me, the wedding. It had been a beautiful day, all white roses and late summer sunlight. Emily looked radiant, of course. I had been proud, truly proud, watching Mark stand there, eyes full of love. When I wrote her card, I remember pausing, thinking about what I wanted her to know as she joined our family. I'd chosen my words carefully. You make me proud. You've brought joy to my son, and that makes you family. I'd signed it simply, Love, Evelyn. She'd hugged me tightly after reading it, her voice bright, her perfume light and floral. Thank you, Mom, she'd said, and I'd felt my heart swell. But now, years later, she'd given those words away to someone else. Used them like borrowed jewelry, polished and worn without memory of where they came from. It wasn't the words themselves that hurt. It was how easily she'd forgotten the meaning behind them. That small moment, that bit of love had become nothing more than another caption for the world to see. I stood and went to the window. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Across the street, a young couple was loading boxes into a car. The woman was laughing as the man tried to fit one more suitcase in the trunk. I found myself smiling despite everything. I remembered being that young, once full of plans and certainty. David and I had been the same two people who believed that love and good intentions could fix anything. But life has a way of humbling even the kindest hearts. I thought about the early days after Mark and Emily married. They'd struggled, as most young couples do. Their credit cards had piled up honeymoon expenses, new furniture. That apartment, Emily insisted, needed modern touches. I remembered the day Mark came over, nervous, asking for help. He'd said, "Mom, just until we get on our feet." I'd written the check without hesitation. Not once, but twice. Thousands of dollars to clear their debt. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need thanks. I just wanted to give them a clean start. A few months later, I found out Emily had booked a spa trip with her friends to celebrate being debt-free. I'd laughed about it at first, thinking maybe it was Mark's idea. But when I gently mentioned it, she'd said almost flippantly, "Oh, Mom, you wouldn't understand. It's just how we celebrate little wins." I had nodded and said nothing. But deep down, I did understand. I understood that some people never see help as kindness, only as something owed. Now, sitting there years later, I realized how the pieces fit together. The pride, the post, the way she looked at me now, polite but distant, as if I were a formality she had to keep around. Somewhere along the way, gratitude had turned into entitlement, and respect had vanished into the bright lights of her perfect online life. I walked over to the shelf in the living room where I kept old photo albums. Dust rose as I opened one. Inside were snapshots of Mark's childhood, his missing front teeth, his high school graduation, his arm around Emily when they first started dating. I lingered on that one. They'd been so young, so hopeful. I remembered how she used to call me Mom without hesitation, how she'd ask for my recipes, laugh with me while we baked. Somewhere between then and now, something had changed. Maybe it was success. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was the simple truth that once she had everything she wanted, she no longer needed me. I closed the album and brushed the dust from my fingers. I wasn't a woman given to anger. My life had taught me that silence often holds more power than shouting. But silence, too, can be sharpened when used at the right time. I sat down again at my desk, the photo on my phone still open beside me. She's the one who makes me proud. The words looped in my mind over and over until they lost their meaning. I thought about how easily people forget the hands that once lifted them. How quickly kindness turns invisible when pride takes over. I let out a slow breath, steady and deliberate. My reflection in the screen looked back at me. Older, yes, but not weak. I had loved deeply, given freely, and been forgotten quietly. But maybe that was about to change. I traced the edge of the photo with my fingertip and said it softly, a promise more than a thought. You borrowed my words. Now let me borrow your pride. I had whispered it as if saying it out loud would make the sting of that morning fade. But it didn't. The house remained still, the light outside beginning to dim, long shadows stretching across the kitchen floor. I hadn't eaten all day. The cake I'd baked sat on the counter untouched, a single slice missing its candle. Somewhere deep down, I think I was still waiting for Mark to call for him to remember. Even at my age, hope is a stubborn thing. I decided to set the table anyway. Old habits have a way of comforting us when nothing else can. I laid out 2 plates, one for me, one for the son who might not come. I told myself it was just to make the kitchen look less empty. But the truth was simpler. I wasn't ready to accept that I would be dining alone. I used the floral china, the ones David had bought me on our 25th anniversary. For special occasions, he'd said. I smiled faintly at the memory. Birthdays had always been special to him. He used to say, "Another year means another chance to be grateful." The stew was simmering on the stove, filling the room with a familiar warmth. I turned on the small radio by the window, letting the sound of soft jazz replace the quiet. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one. I kept glancing at the clock, pretending not to. 7:15. Maybe he was on his way. Maybe he'd walk in any minute with a sheepish smile and a bouquet from the gas station, the kind of flowers that wilt in a day, but still manage to mean something. At 7:30, my phone buzzed. My heart leapt before my eyes even reached the screen. The message was short. "We'll celebrate later. Mom. Promise." I stared at it for a moment, the words blurring as my throat tightened. Later. It was always later. Later visits, later dinners, later plans. Somehow later had become the polite word for never. I typed a reply, then deleted it. What was there to say? "That's okay" felt false, and "I miss you" felt too heavy, so I said nothing. I put the phone face down on the table and took a long breath. The stew was done. I turned off the stove and ladled a small portion into my bowl. The first bite tasted fine, though I couldn't really taste anything. The house was too quiet, and in that quiet, thoughts grew louder. I thought about Mark as a boy, how he'd once wrapped his arms around my waist and said, "When I grow up, I'll take care of you, Mom." He had meant it. I know he had. But life changes people. Marriage changes them too. Halfway through dinner, the phone rang. For a second, I thought maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe that message wasn't the end of the evening after all. But the voice on the other end wasn't Mark's. It was a woman's young professional, hurried. "Hello, is this Mr. Harris?" she asked. "This is his mother," I said, straightening in my chair. "May I ask who's calling?" There was a pause, the kind that tells you something's wrong. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," she said quickly. "I must have the wrong number. I was trying to reach Mr. Mark Harris regarding his business account. There's an urgent matter." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. "I see," I said slowly. "This is Evelyn Harris, his mother. Is everything all right?" Another small pause. Then a professional smile slipped back into her voice. "I really can't disclose details, ma'am. It's confidential. But we were following up on an overdraft notice. Again, my apologies for disturbing you." Before I could ask anything else, the line went dead. I sat there holding the phone against my ear long after the call had ended. Overdraft notice. The words echoed in my head like an old bell. I set the phone down carefully, as if it were something fragile. For years, I'd believed Mark was doing well. He'd told me the business was steady, that Emily's online work was taking off, that they were saving for a new house. And I had believed him because that's what mothers do, we believe. But the woman's voice replayed in my mind, crisp and certain, like someone who makes calls like that every day. The stew had gone cold. I pushed the bowl away and folded my hands in my lap. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the slow dawning of understanding. It wasn't just distance between us, it was secrecy. I got up and walked to the kitchen window. The street was empty now, quiet, except for the low hum of crickets. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I could see my reflection faintly in the glass, an older woman standing alone, a birthday candle burned down to nothing behind her. I tried to imagine Mark's face when he sent that text earlier. Was he distracted, tired, or maybe worried? I'd always known when something was weighing on him. A mother's instincts never retire. A small part of me wanted to call him to ask outright if everything was all right. But another part, older, wiser, stopped me. Whatever trouble he was in, he hadn't wanted me to know. And if he hadn't wanted me to know, then maybe I wasn't meant to stay in the dark much longer. I went to the counter and picked up my phone again, scrolling through the few old photos we'd taken together. Mark and Emily at Christmas. Mark laughing with his arm around me. Emily's smile bright, but distant. For the first time, I noticed how her eyes never seemed to look at me directly in any of them. Always toward Mark, always toward something else. The call from the bank replayed in my mind, again every word of it. Urgent matter. Overdraft. Business account. I could almost hear the click of the woman's keyboard as she realized her mistake. It wasn't a mistake, though. Not really. It was a glimpse, small, uninvited, but telling. I exhaled slowly, the kind of long breath that feels more like a decision than a sigh. I looked back at the empty chair across from me, the untouched plate, the flickering candle stub, and whispered to the quiet room. So that's what you've been hiding from me. I said it softly, though no one could hear me. The room was dim now, the candle on the table reduced to a small puddle of wax. I sat for a moment, letting the words linger. There was something strange about that call, something that pulled at me long after the phone went silent. Mark was hiding something. I could feel it in my bones. He had his father's sense of pride, but not his discipline. David used to say that pride is useful only when it doesn't blind you. I wondered now if that was exactly what had happened to my son. After cleaning the table, I walked into the small room that used to be David's study. The scent of old paper and cedar still hung in the air. The desk was neat, as he'd always kept it. I sat down and turned on the lamp, its warm glow spreading over a stack of files and folders. I hadn't opened them in years. Our financial papers, old investments documents I'd promised to sort through, but never did. Now I needed answers, and something told me they were buried in here. I sifted through the folders one by one, checking labels in David's careful handwriting. Taxes, mortgage, business startup. That one caught my eye. It was from 8 years ago, the year Mark had come to me with his big idea. His first company, the one I'd helped fund after David's passing. I remembered how hopeful he'd looked that day, standing in the doorway with blueprints and big dreams. I'd been proud, of course. I wanted to believe he could build something lasting. The folder was thick, filled with contracts, bank forms, and legal documents. I pulled one free, a loan agreement, the official paperwork for Mark's business. My name was there, right where it should be. But below it, another name appeared, one that made me pause. Margaret Shaw. The name stirred something faint but unpleasant in my memory. I read it again, certain it couldn't be coincidence. Margaret Shaw. The same Margaret who was Emily's mother. My chest tightened as I tried to make sense of it. Why would her name be there? Why would she have been involved in my son's company? I flipped through more pages until I found her signature neat and deliberate, right beside mine. Co-signer. A dull unease crawled up my spine. Margaret and I had met several times, weddings, holidays, a few family dinners. Always polite, always distant. She'd seemed harmless enough, though something about her manner had never quite felt sincere. She had that practiced charm some women wear like perfume, pleasant at first, but cloying if you linger too long. I remembered her smile at the wedding, that tight curve of the mouth that didn't reach her eyes. The memory tugged at me until another one followed clearer this time. Years before Emily ever met Mark, back when David was still alive, there had been a woman who worked at his bank. A woman who always found excuses to stop by his office, to linger when I came to bring him lunch. Her name, I realized, slowly, had been Margaret. Margaret Shaw. I hadn't thought about her in decades. She was younger than me back then, sharp ambitious with a voice like honey when she spoke to David. He'd mentioned her once or twice, always, casually. She's a quick learner, he'd said, or she's got a good head for numbers. I never questioned it. I trusted him. And I was right to David's loyalty had never wavered. But one afternoon I'd stopped by unannounced with lunch, and I'd caught that look in Margaret's eyes. Not shame, not guilt, but longing. Quiet, unspoken longing for something she could never have. She'd left the bank a few months later. David told me she'd moved to another branch, but I remembered the way she looked at me that day, half resentment, half envy. Some women let go of old feelings gracefully. Others let them harden into something uglier. Now her name sat on this paper years later beside mine, entangled in my son's business. Coincidence? I didn't believe in those anymore. Not when the same woman had raised Emily, who now treated me like an inconvenience, a relic to be tolerated. I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me. It began to make sense in a way that chilled me. Margaret had found a way back into my life through my son, through her daughter, through my kindness. I thought about Emily's confidence, her entitlement, her quiet disdain that had grown bolder with every passing year. She hadn't learned that on her own. That kind of pride was inherited. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted another sheet from the folder, a note from the bank addressed to both me and Margaret. I scanned it quickly, my eyes catching on a line that confirmed what I feared she'd been involved in the initial funding as a personal guarantor. I could almost hear her voice smooth and practiced, convincing Mark that it was just a formality, a small favor for his late father's memory. But it wasn't a favor. It was leverage. The realization settled like ice in my chest. Margaret had always wanted something from my family. Back then, she'd wanted David. When she couldn't have him, she'd turned her gaze elsewhere. I thought of Emily, how she'd charmed Mark, how quickly everything had moved. I'd once believed it was love. Now I wasn't so sure. I looked toward the framed photographs on the shelf. One of them was from Mark and Emily's wedding. I stood and took it down, brushing a thin layer of dust from the glass. My eyes went first to Mark and Emily in the center, young, glowing full of promise. But behind them, almost hidden in the blur of guests, stood Margaret. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable, her smile just wide enough to seem polite. I studied her face carefully, the way her eyes rested not on her daughter, but slightly to the side toward me. And in that look, even frozen in time, I saw it. The same quiet envy from all those years ago. The same cold satisfaction of a woman who had waited a very long time. My fingers tightened around the frame. So I murmured, tracing her image with my thumb, "You never really left, did you?" And as the lamplight flickered across her frozen smile, I finally understood what I had been too blind to see before. Margaret Shaw hadn't just found a way back into my life, she had found a way to finish what she started. That thought followed me for days, like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. Every time the phone rang, every time Mark's name flashed across the screen, I felt a small flicker of dread. Not because of him, but because of who stood quietly behind him, now his wife and the woman who had raised her. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd found in the papers. Some truths are better kept close until you know what to do with them. Instead, I waited, listening, observing, pretending nothing had changed. But everything had. It was late Saturday morning when they came by. I heard Mark's car before I saw it, that familiar hum of tires crunching over the gravel. My heart lifted against my better judgment. I hadn't seen them since before my birthday. When the doorbell rang, I took a moment to steady myself before opening it. Mark looked the same handsome, tired, distracted. Emily stood beside him, radiant as always, a designer bag draped over her arm, sunglasses perched on her head, even though the day was overcast. "Hi, Mom," Mark said, smiling, leaning in to hug me. It was warm but brief, the kind of hug that comes with an invisible clock ticking behind it. "Happy late birthday," Emily said brightly, stepping forward. "We brought you something special." She handed me a glossy box wrapped in gold paper. "It's from Paris." "Very exclusive." I smiled, polite and cautious. "That's very thoughtful of you." She waited for me to open it, so I did. Inside was a sleek bottle of perfume, French expensive, the kind that sits behind glass counters. I recognized the brand immediately. It was the same one that had given me hives the last time I'd tried it years ago. The same one I'd once told Emily I couldn't wear because of the allergy. "Oh," I said softly, turning the bottle in my hands. "It's lovely." Emily's smile widened. "I thought you'd like it. My mom wears it all the time. It's her favorite." "Of course it is," I thought. I set the bottle gently on the table. "That's very kind of you." We moved to the kitchen for tea. Mark busied himself with his phone while Emily talked. Mostly about Paris, her trip, the food, the shopping, the influencer event she'd been invited to. She spoke like someone giving a performance, each detail rehearsed to sound effortless. I let her talk, nodding when appropriate, offering small smiles. "It was magical," she said, lifting her cup to her lips. "We stayed at the Four Seasons. Mom adored it. She said it reminded her of her younger days back when she worked in finance. She even ran into someone who remembered her from the old bank days." Can you believe that I froze for a moment, just a flicker, but enough? "Did she?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yes," Emily said, swirling her tea. "She told me she used to work with someone named David Harris. Isn't that funny? She said he was very charming." The words dropped like stones into the quiet space between us. Mark didn't look up from his phone, but I could feel the air shift. Emily kept talking too quickly now, unaware, or perhaps enjoying the discomfort she stirred. "Mom told me some people never change. They always look for control even when they should just let go." I set my cup down carefully, the porcelain clinking against the saucer. "Your mother's very insightful," I said evenly. Emily smiled sweetly, tilting her head. "She is. She's always been the one I go to for advice. She understands how people work. She says kindness is wonderful, but it can make you weak if you're not careful." For a long moment, I said nothing. I studied her face, the careful makeup, the bright eyes that didn't quite meet mine. She was parroting Margaret word for word. That woman's voice was all over her daughter's tongue. I realized then that this visit wasn't just courtesy, it was strategy. A quiet test to see how much I knew, how much I would show. I turned my gaze to Mark. "How's business?" I asked, shifting the conversation. He looked up startled, as if I'd caught him off guard. "Good," he said quickly. "Busy, you know. We're expanding, trying to keep up." His words were too quick, his smile too thin. "That's wonderful," I said softly. "I'm glad things are stable." He nodded, but didn't meet my eyes. I could see the small tension in his shoulders, the same one he used to have when he lied about breaking something as a child. We finished our tea with more polite small talk, Emily praising Paris, Mark glancing at the clock. After an hour, they stood to leave. Emily kissed my cheek lightly, her perfume lingering longer than her warmth. "Don't use too much of that perfume, it's strong," she said with a laugh. When the door closed, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I turned to tidy the cups, moving slowly, letting my thoughts catch up. On the table beside the gift box lay a small stack of papers Emily had set down during our conversation. I gathered them absently, meaning to place them by the door for the next visit. But as I lifted the top sheet, something caught my eye. It was a credit card statement, unfolded crisp, printed with the faint logo of Mark's company at the top. My name wasn't on it, but his was. And beneath it, a list of transactions, airline tickets, hotel charges, luxury stores, all dated from the week of Emily's Paris trip. My heart sank, a mix of disappointment and grim recognition. The truth was staring right at me, bold and indifferent. She had used company funds for that vacation. My son's business. My money once passed through his hands, now spent on silk dresses and champagne. I sat down slowly, the paper trembling slightly between my fingers. Margaret's influence, Emily's pride, Mark's silence, it all fit together now, piece by careful piece. The room seemed to tilt with the weight of what I'd discovered. I looked down at the statement again, at the printed company logo staring back at me like a signature of betrayal. So that was it. That was the cost of pride. And as I folded the paper neatly, setting it aside, one thought came clear as glass. Margaret wasn't done yet. But neither was I. Because if this was her game, she'd just made her first mistake. And right there on the edge of that quiet afternoon, my eyes fell once more on the logo at the top of the bill, Mark's company name sharp and unmistakable. It was the first solid proof I had, and I knew it meant only one thing: this wasn't over. I sat with that thought for a long while. The paper spread before me like a confession no one had meant for me to read. The numbers didn't lie: airfare, hotel suites, fine dining, all neatly itemized under Mark's company account. My son might not have known, but ignorance wouldn't protect him from the damage. Pride had a price, and sooner or later, someone was going to pay it. The next morning I woke with a strange sense of calm. It wasn't anger anymore, not even sadness. It was clarity, the kind that comes after you've accepted what you already knew deep down. I made my coffee, watched the steam curl upward, and began gathering the papers. The house deed came first. I had kept it locked away in the old cedar box David had built years ago. Every nail, every hinge of that box was his handiwork. And somehow it made what I was about to do feel right, almost blessed. Next, I printed copies of the credit card statement. I'd found the one stamped with Mark's company logo. I slipped them into the plain white envelope along with the deed and sealed it carefully. No note. No explanations. Sometimes silence carried more weight than words ever could. By afternoon, I called Mark and asked him and Emily to stop by. My tone was steady, casual even, but I could tell from his pause that he heard something in my voice. "Sure, Mom," he said finally. "We can come after lunch." When the doorbell rang, I was ready. Emily entered first, wearing a bright red coat, her perfume filling the air immediately. Mark followed, his shoulders tense, his smile forced. "We won't stay long," Emily said quickly. "We're meeting friends later." "That's fine," I said, gesturing toward the sitting room. "I just have something for you both." They exchanged a look. I could see a flicker of suspicion in Emily's eyes. Already, she was always searching for the angle, the hidden meaning behind every gesture. I handed her the envelope. "A small gift," I said. "Something I think you'll want to see." She hesitated before taking it. her perfectly manicured fingers tapping lightly on the seal. "What is it?" "Go ahead," I said softly. She opened it. First came the deed. She frowned as she unfolded the papers. "The house," she said, glancing at Mark. "Why are you showing us this?" "Keep reading," I told her. Her eyes moved down the page, then to the next set of papers, the credit card statements. I watched as her face changed. A flush crept up her neck, her lips tightening as she scanned the lines of numbers and charges. She didn't need long to understand what she was looking at. Mark leaned in beside her. "What's that?" he asked. She tried to hide the papers, but he caught a glimpse. His brow furrowed confusion, giving way to disbelief. "Emily," he said slowly, "these are company expenses. Why is Paris on here?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I could see it then, the panic behind her composure, the quick flutter of her pulse at her throat. Mark turned to me, eyes wide. "Mom, where did you get this?" I met his gaze evenly. "You left it here," I said. "Or rather, Emily did. I just thought you should see what your company's been paying for." Emily straightened her voice sharp now. "You had no right to go through my things." I tilted my head. "And you had no right to use business funds for personal pleasure," I said gently. "But here we are." Mark's hands ran through his hair, frustration spilling out. "I can't believe this," he muttered, staring at the papers. "Emily, tell me this isn't what it looks like." She said nothing. Her eyes darted toward the window as if the right words might be floating somewhere out there waiting to be caught. Finally, she said, "It's not a big deal. I was going to pay it back." "You're overreacting." Mark's voice cracked. "Overreacting? This could ruin us." I watched them both in silence for a moment, before speaking again, my tone soft but unyielding. "Your pride trip came at a cost, my dear," I said, looking at Emily, "and not just in dollars." She turned toward me, her mouth opening as if to reply, but I could see she had nothing to say. The weight of the evidence of the truth left her speechless. I stood then, taking the envelope back from her trembling hands, and placed it on the coffee table. "I suggest you keep this," I said, "a reminder of what happens when pride overshadows honesty." Mark sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. Emily looked at him, then at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in shame, but in anger. I'd struck something in her, something raw and defensive. I could almost feel Margaret's voice whispering behind her expression, telling her not to bend, not to apologize. They left soon after. No goodbye hug this time, just the sound of the door closing, harder than necessary. I stood at the window, watching their car pull away, a thin line of exhaust curling up behind it. My heart ached for Mark, but not for her. I knew she would run straight to Margaret, and that my name would pass between them like a curse. That night the house felt heavier than usual. I made tea, though I barely tasted it, and tried to read, but my mind wouldn't settle. Around 10, my phone buzzed. I glanced down, expecting perhaps a message from Mark, maybe an apology or an explanation. But it wasn't from him. The screen showed an unknown number. The message was short. "You'll regret this." I stared at it for a long moment, feeling the faintest chill run down my spine. Then I set the phone face down on the table. Regret, I thought, was for people who acted without purpose. And what I had done, I'd done with absolute purpose. I didn't sleep much that night. The message from the unknown number kept flashing in my mind, its words glowing like small embers in the dark. "You'll regret this." I almost laughed when I thought about it. Regret, I'd lived too long and lost too much to be frightened by empty threats. Still, I turned off my phone and left it on the counter face down. The house was quiet again, and I let the silence remind me who I was, a woman who had built her life on patience, not fear. By morning, the world outside had already begun to move in ways I hadn't expected. I learned about it the same way everyone learns about everything these days through the internet. My neighbor Ruth came by to drop off some muffins, her face buzzing with excitement, the way people get when tragedy isn't theirs but close enough to taste. "Evelyn," she said, her voice low. "Have you seen the news?" I hadn't. But the moment she said Emily's name, I knew. I thanked her, set the muffins down, and opened my laptop. It didn't take long to find it. A local online gossip site had posted an article. Influencer Emily Harris accused of using company funds for luxury travel. Beneath it was a photo from Paris, the same one I'd seen on my birthday. Emily smiling in front of the Eiffel Tower, her hand on her mother's shoulder. The comments poured beneath it like a flood. Fake. Spoiled. Typical rich girl pretending to work. The story spread fast. By afternoon, Emily's social media was filled with angry posts and disappointed followers. Screenshots of the company credit card statement were circulating online. Someone must have leaked them, though I knew I hadn't. The truth has a way of slipping through cracks, especially when pride has left so many open. I sat back in my chair, reading comment after comment, the words sharp, but strangely satisfying. It wasn't joy I felt, it was justice, the kind that arrives quietly but firmly, like rain after a long drought. I knew what it was like to be humiliated in silence. Now Emily would know too. By the end of the day, it seemed everyone in our small community had heard. At the grocery store, 2 women whispered near the fruit aisle, glancing my way and lowering their voices when they thought I couldn't hear. At the post office, the clerk who'd known me for 20 years leaned forward and said softly, "Shame about your daughter-in-law. Such a pretty girl. You'd never think." I smiled politely, the kind of smile that keeps people guessing. That evening, as I sat on the porch, I could hear the faint chatter from the neighbors next door, their words carried easily through the still air. "It's all over the internet," one said. "She was bragging about that Paris trip just weeks ago." "Her poor husband," the other replied. "I bet his mother's mortified." I let their voices drift over me like a passing breeze. Mortified wasn't the word. Resolved, maybe. Peaceful, even. There's a strange calm that comes when you stop needing to explain yourself. Inside, I brewed a pot of tea and turned on the news. They were talking about it there too now. Just a brief segment, a scrolling headline, "Local influencer faces backlash over company expense scandal." The reporter's voice was smooth, practiced, indifferent. Just another story in a day full of them. But to me, it was proof that the truth had found its voice. By nightfall, I had almost convinced myself the worst of it was over. I imagined Emily pacing their house, her phone buzzing endlessly, her followers turning on her one by one. I imagined Mark trying to calm her down, caught between shame and disbelief. I didn't take pleasure in it exactly, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing balance was being restored. It was nearly 9 when the phone rang. I recognized the number immediately, Mark's. I hesitated before answering, bracing myself. His voice came through tense, fast, the way it always did when he was trying to sound calm, but wasn't. "Mom, he said we need to talk." I kept my voice steady. "Of course. What's wrong?" "You know what's wrong," he said, his tone tight. "Emily's a mess. Someone leaked private company information. It's everywhere. Her sponsors are calling, people are canceling deals, she's being destroyed online." I waited a moment before answering. "That's unfortunate," I said quietly. He let out a sharp breath. "Unfortunate, Mom. She says it came from you." I felt my heart slow, not race. From me, she swears you had those papers. The ones you showed us. His voice cracked slightly more from confusion than accusation. She says you leaked everything to humiliate her. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock. I imagined Emily in the background pacing, feeding him those words, her voice full of rehearsed outrage. I could almost hear Margaret's shadow in it too. "Mark," I said, finally. Choosing my words carefully, if Emily's looking for someone to blame, I can't help her. The truth doesn't need my help to spread. He was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, tired. "Mom, did you—" I closed my eyes. There was no good answer to give him, none he was ready to hear. So I said nothing. Silence, after all, is its own kind of truth. He exhaled, frustration rising again. "Emily says you leaked everything." The line crackled between us, his words hanging heavy, sharp, and final. I didn't respond. I just stared out the window, watching the night gather outside my house, knowing that somewhere out there Margaret Shaw was smiling. I could almost see her sitting in her daughter's living room, a glass of wine in hand, whispering poison into Emily's ear, while Mark sat helplessly between them. The pattern was familiar. Margaret had always known how to turn silence into guilt, how to twist decency into weakness. And now she had found the perfect stage for her performance. The days that followed were uneasy ones. Mark didn't call. Emily, of course, wouldn't dare. The air between us had thickened, but I didn't mind the quiet. Quiet gave me time to think. I went about my routines, watering the plants, reading by the window, baking bread I didn't eat. But beneath that stillness, something inside me had sharpened. The older I got, the more I understood that people who play games with pride always leave traces. All I had to do was watch and wait. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the confrontation, that I first learned what Margaret had done. I was sorting through some old mail when I noticed an envelope marked "Corporate Records, Urgent." It wasn't addressed to me, but to Mark's company. Our shared last name must have confused the postman. I shouldn't have opened it, I suppose, but something in my gut told me I needed to. Inside was a copy of a company board notice. I scanned it quickly, my eyes catching on a name I hadn't expected to see: Margaret Shaw. The notice stated that, using her rights as a co-signer on the original business documents, Margaret had temporarily transferred majority control of the company to Emily Shaw Harris in order to protect the business during a period of reputational risk. Reputational risk. The phrase almost made me laugh. Margaret had always been good with words that dressed up ugliness. It was her way of saying, "You can't handle this, so I will." I sat back in my chair, letting the paper rest in my lap. I wasn't surprised, not really. Margaret had been moving toward this for years, slowly tightening her grip around my son's life until he couldn't tell where her influence ended and his decisions began. But to use her old signature, her dormant rights from the founding documents, that was audacious even for her. I spent the rest of that afternoon pacing the kitchen. Anger tried to rise, but I pushed it down. Anger clouds judgment, and I couldn't afford that. Instead, I made tea, sat down at the table, and opened my laptop. If Margaret wanted to play the role of protector, I would play something else entirely: the observer who sees what others miss. The company's website hadn't been updated in weeks, but its financial reports were public. A few clicks led me to the quarterly expenses section. It didn't take long to see where the cracks were forming. Large sums labeled client entertainment and brand partnerships were scattered across the statements. Most were vague, but a few included descriptions: designer purchases, luxury hotels, private events. The numbers weren't just large, they were reckless. I printed every page and organized them carefully into folders. I'd learned long ago that truth carried more weight when it was neat and undeniable. Next, I searched my own files for older receipts records I'd kept from my early investment in the company. David had taught me that lesson: always keep a paper trail. And there it was, right where I'd left it, the original transaction that had brought Margaret's name into the mix. Her co-signature had been a technicality, a convenience. But now she was using it like a weapon. As I looked over the receipts, I could almost hear David's voice in the back of my mind. When someone shows you their greed, he used to say, "Believe them the first time." I hadn't then. But I did now. Evening crept in the light, turning gold through the kitchen window. I organized everything into a single binder: company statements, receipts, proof of Emily's spending, copies of Margaret's transfer notice. It was all there, the story written in ink and numbers, a record of pride disguised as power. I paused when I came across a line from one of Emily's expense reports: event marketing, Paris influencer retreat. The charge was identical to the flight cost on the credit card statement I'd found earlier. She hadn't even tried to hide it. It was arrogance, plain and simple, the kind that makes people believe the rules will never apply to them. When I finally leaned back in my chair, exhaustion washed over me. Not the kind that comes from work, but the kind that comes from seeing too much truth at once. I wasn't just looking at mismanagement. I was looking at betrayal, at a chain of decisions built on entitlement and lies. I knew Margaret's move to transfer control to Emily wasn't about protecting the company. It was about protecting herself. If the business fell, she'd make sure my family took the blame. She'd done it once before in smaller ways, when she'd poisoned Emily's heart against me. Now she was doing it again, just on a grander scale. I closed the binder and set it on the counter. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a wind had picked up, rustling the leaves against the window. I stood there for a long moment, looking at that binder, the quiet weight of it on the table. It was strange how calm I felt. Not righteous, not vengeful, just certain. I had no intention of shouting or making threats. People like Margaret and Emily built their worlds out of noise, but truth didn't need to shout. Truth waited. Truth revealed itself in time. I reached over, turned off the kitchen light, and let the room fall into the dim glow of twilight. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. Older, wiser, steadier than I'd felt in years. I whispered it softly, not to the room, but to the shadow of Margaret herself, wherever she was. If pride built her empire, I murmured, truth will tear it down. The room was dark, except for the soft glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. I stood there for a while, repeating those words in my head until they became more than a thought. They became a promise. I had the evidence, the facts, and the silence of two people who thought they were untouchable. What I didn't have yet was a voice loud enough to make the truth heard. But I knew someone who did. The next morning, I called Rachel Moore. It had been years since we last spoke. She'd once worked with David at the bank, back when they both believed in integrity and in the power of transparency. After David's death, she'd left the finance world for journalism, saying she wanted to expose the kind of greed that had destroyed too many good people. I'd followed her career from afar, proud of her courage, but never imagining I'd one day need her help. "Evelyn Harris," she said, when she answered, her voice warm with surprise. "It's been ages." "It has," I said, smiling, though she couldn't see it. "And I'm afraid I'm not calling just to catch up." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the tone of my voice. Rachel was sharp that way she could hear the weight behind a sentence. "What's happened?" she asked finally. I told her everything. Not all at once, but carefully, piece by piece. The Paris trip, the credit card bill, the fake company expenses, and finally the transfer of control from Mark to Emily, orchestrated by Margaret Shaw under the guise of protection. Rachel didn't interrupt. I could hear her scribbling notes, her quiet hums of acknowledgement. When I finished, there was a pause. "You have proof?" she asked. "I do. Every receipt, every transfer, every name I said. And I'm not giving it to the police." "Not yet." "You want the story told," she said simply. "Yes. I want the truth seen, not hidden behind lawyers and PR statements. They built this image of perfection. Let the world see what it's really made of." Rachel exhaled, slow and thoughtful. "Send it to me," she said. "All of it. I'll verify the documents myself. If it checks out, I'll publish." It took 2 days. During that time, I went about my life as if nothing had changed. I baked Reed, even tended the garden, pretending not to notice the silence from Mark. The calm before a storm always has a strange kind of beauty to it. Peaceful, deceptive, almost tender. But I knew what was coming. On the 3rd morning, I woke to a flood of messages. The headline was everywhere. Local influencer accused of using company funds for luxury travel. Beneath it, a sharp, professional photo of Emily smiling in front of the Eiffel Tower, paired with details from the company's financial records. Rachel had done her job well. Every fact was airtight, every sentence measured. There was no malice in the article, only truth laid bare for anyone to see. The reaction was instant. Sponsors began dropping Emily within hours. Her social media followers turned on her, their comments shifting from admiration to disgust. Screenshots of her extravagant posts now read like evidence against her. "She preaches authenticity, but lives off other people's money," one person wrote. "All fake. Just another rich fraud," said another. By evening, even national outlets had picked up the story. The woman who had spent years curating a flawless online life was unraveling in real time, her empire collapsing under the weight of her own vanity. I watched it all from the comfort of my kitchen, a cup of tea warming my hands. The world didn't need me to gloat. It was doing the work on its own. Still, I couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction that came with seeing justice move faster than expected. But not all of it felt sweet. There was Mark caught in the middle, his name now linked to the scandal. He hadn't called, but I knew what he must be feeling. Betrayal, confusion, shame. I didn't want to destroy him. I only wanted him to see the truth of the people he trusted most. By late afternoon, the media storm had grown teeth. Reporters were stationed outside Emily's home, flashes going off as she tried to leave. She wore oversized sunglasses, her expression hidden, her posture fragile. For the first time, she looked small, not powerful. The phone rang just as the 6 o'clock news began. The number was familiar, though I hadn't seen it appear on my screen in years. I let it ring once more before answering. "Hello, Margaret," I said, my voice calm. Her reply came out sharp, breathless, trembling with anger. "You've ruined my daughter." I said nothing at first. The silence between us was thick, the kind that forced the truth to surface. I could hear her breathing quick and shallow. She wasn't used to being on the losing side of a story. "She ruined herself," I said finally, my tone even. "You just helped her along the way." "You think you've won," she spat. "You think you're better than me?" "I don't think about you at all, Margaret," I said. "But it seems you've thought about me for most of your life." There was a pause, and for the first time I heard something crack in her voice. Not anger this time, but fear. "You don't know what you've started," she whispered. I could almost see her face, then pale, rattled, realizing too late that the woman she thought was harmless had just undone years of quiet manipulation. I leaned back in my chair, the evening light soft against my skin, and said gently, "No, Margaret. You don't know what I've finished." She hung up, but I didn't move. The phone still buzzed faintly in my hand, her echo fading. I set it down and looked out the window, the sky streaked with gold and gray. Somewhere beyond all that noise, I imagined David smiling. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a bystander in my own story. I felt steady, certain, alive. And as the light dimmed, I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, the truth always finds its way home. I hadn't realized how literal that thought would become. The next afternoon, the truth came pounding at my front door. It was just after 4 when I heard the sharp, hurried knock 3 times each, louder than the last. I knew before I opened it who it was. Some people carry a kind of storm with them, and Margaret Shaw had been gathering clouds for weeks. I took a slow breath and turned the knob. There she stood, her hair perfectly styled, but her face strained, her eyes burning with a fury that age hadn't softened. Beside her was Emily, pale and trembling sunglasses, hiding what little composure she had left. Neither waited to be invited in. Margaret pushed past me, her perfume sharp and invasive, the scent of someone used to getting her way. "So this is how it ends," she said, her voice quivering with contained rage. "You sit here smiling while you destroy my daughter's life." I closed the door behind them and stayed where I was. "Good afternoon, Margaret." "Emily, don't you dare pretend politeness now," Margaret snapped. "You think you've won, don't you? You think humiliating her makes you righteous." Emily stood silently by the window, her arms crossed, her breathing shallow. There were faint smudges beneath her eyes, the kind that no amount of makeup could hide. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, like a child, hiding behind her mother's shadow. "I didn't humiliate her," I said quietly. "She did that herself." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitterness. "You've always been jealous of her," she said. "Of her youth, her success, the way people admire her. You couldn't stand that she built something bigger than you ever did." Her words hit like darts meant to provoke, but I had weathered sharper ones in my life. I met her gaze evenly. "Margaret, I'm too old to envy anyone's illusions." Her lip curled. "Illusions. You call success an illusion. She worked for everything she has. She used what didn't belong to her," I replied. My tone was calm, deliberate. "That's not work, Margaret. That's theft." Emily turned, then her voice breaking. "You don't understand. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I thought I could fix it before anyone found out." "Mom said, 'Don't,'" Margaret interrupted sharply, her hand rising to silence her daughter. "You don't owe her explanations. This woman has hated us from the beginning." I stepped closer, not threateningly, but firmly. "You should be careful, Margaret. Hatred and awareness aren't the same thing. I saw you for who you were a long time ago. I just hope time might soften you." Her eyes flashed. "You're delusional," she spat. "You think I care about what you think of me. You were never good enough for David, and you knew it. He was brilliant, ambitious. He needed someone like me, someone who understood him." The words sliced through the air, and for a moment, the room fell silent. Emily's head snapped toward her mother in shock. I didn't flinch. I'd known it once years ago, though. Hearing it said aloud after all this time carried a strange, hollow finality. "You loved him," I said softly. "You never forgave him for choosing me." Margaret's voice trembled, anger and old grief intertwining. "He made a mistake. And now you're making one too. You've turned his legacy into a weapon against his own son's family." I took a long breath, steady and full. "No, I'm protecting it. David built everything we had on honesty and compassion. You taught your daughter to take. I taught my son to give. You may not like which lesson lasted longer." Emily's composure cracked, then a quiet sob escaping before she covered her mouth. Margaret spun toward her, furious. Don't cry in front of her, she hissed. She wants to see you weak. I felt something shift in that moment. For years, I'd thought of Emily as Margaret's reflection, spoiled, proud, unreachable. But now I saw her differently. Beneath all that pretense was a frightened young woman who had never truly stood on her own. Margaret had built her to mirror her own pride, and now both mirrors were cracking. You don't have to keep defending her, I said softly to Emily. You're old enough to see what she's done, what it's cost you. Don't you dare speak to her. Margaret snapped, stepping between us. Her voice rose, the years of restraint unraveling. You think you can shame me? You're nothing but a bitter old woman who can't stand being forgotten. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and lingering. I let them sit there, refusing to be drawn into her chaos. Instead, I turned and walked to the cabinet against the far wall. Inside, in the lowest drawer, was the cedar box David had built all those years ago. I opened it slowly, feeling the smooth grain beneath my fingers. Margaret's voice wavered behind me. What are you doing? I didn't answer immediately. My hands found what I'd been looking for. A small envelope yellowed with age, the handwriting unmistakable. David's. I held it gently, the paper fragile from time, but the ink still clear. I turned to face them both, their eyes fixed on me now. David left something for moments like this, I said quietly. He knew truth always outlives noise. Margaret scoffed, but her confidence faltered. What are you talking about? I looked at her, then at Emily. One woman trapped by her lies, the other by her inheritance of them, and I felt something close to pity. You'll see, I said softly. And with that, I placed the envelope on the table, my fingers resting on it like a promise waiting to be opened. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air between us was thick, almost heavy, the way a room feels before a storm breaks. Margaret's eyes were fixed on the envelope, suspicion flickering behind her fury. Emily stood a few steps behind her mother, uncertain and pale, her arms wrapped tightly across her chest. I broke the silence first. David wrote this a month before he passed, I said softly. He gave it to me and told me to open it only if our family ever forgot what mattered. Margaret laughed, but her voice shook. You expect me to believe that after everything you've done, I didn't answer. Instead, I slid my thumb beneath the flap and unfolded the letter with care. The paper had yellowed slightly with time, but his handwriting, strong, deliberate, familiar, had not faded. My hands trembled for just a moment before I began to read. My dearest Evelyn, it began. If you are reading this, it means something in our family has gone astray. I hope you will forgive me for not saying these words sooner. Years ago, before we were married, a colleague at the bank, Margaret Shaw, fell into some financial trouble. I lent her money quietly because she was proud and would not accept help openly. It was never more than kindness. But pride is a strange thing. It can make people see affection where there is only goodwill. The room went still. Margaret's breath caught audibly. Emily's eyes darted between us, confusion flickering in her expression. I continued. I fear my silence may have allowed misunderstanding to take root. If one day that misunderstanding reaches our children or their children, I want you to remember this. I never loved anyone but you. And if pride ever poisons our family, let truth be the cure. My voice cracked on the last line, but I forced myself to finish reading. Then I folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. No one moved. Margaret stared at me, her face drained of color. He helped me, she stammered, as if the words themselves refused to settle. Out of pity, out of kindness, I said quietly. The kind you never understood. Her lip quivered, the sharpness that had always defined her suddenly gone. "All these years," she whispered. "All these years, I thought—" She stopped herself, her voice breaking. "I thought he cared for me." "He did," I said gently. "But not the way you wanted." For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret's strength seemed to crumble. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling. Emily moved toward her, but Margaret didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on the letter, as if she could rewrite its words simply by staring hard enough. Emily spoke softly, almost to herself. "Mom." Margaret didn't answer. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. I watched her, feeling no triumph, only a quiet ache for what pride had stolen from her life. After a moment, Emily turned to me. Her voice was small. "You really didn't mean to destroy us, did you?" I met her eyes. "No, Emily. I meant to stop the lie before it destroyed anyone else." The room felt different then, less like a battlefield, more like the aftermath of one. The fury had burned out, leaving behind the raw, fragile quiet of truth. I stood and walked to the window, the evening light spilling across the room in soft gold streaks. Outside, the garden swayed gently in the wind, untouched by everything that had happened inside these walls. Behind me, I could hear Margaret sobbing quietly, a sound I never imagined I would hear from her. Emily stood beside her, silent, now no longer defiant. There was nothing left to say. The truth had spoken for all of us. I looked out at the fading sky, my reflection faint against the glass. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then, almost in a whisper, I spoke to no one in particular, maybe to David, maybe to myself. "Truth has its price." The words lingered long after I said them, echoing through the quiet house. In the days that followed, that price began to reveal itself slowly, inevitably, like cracks spreading through glass. The truth had set things right, yes, but not without leaving a mark on everyone it touched. News traveled fast. The journalist Rachel had published a follow-up piece, an update, confirming the investigation into Emily's misuse of company funds. This time, the tone was colder, factual, final. The article named both Emily and Margaret as responsible parties in the financial mismanagement of the business. Within hours, Emily's sponsors began to distance themselves. One by one, contracts dissolved, endorsements vanished, and the shining world she'd built online crumbled to dust. I saw the comments. People she once called fans now turned against her, calling her a fraud, a thief, a liar. The same faces that had praised her luxury lifestyle now mocked her desperation. It was brutal, and part of me pitied her. But another part, the one that had been humiliated, ignored, and betrayed, felt something else. Not triumph exactly, but a sense that the scales had finally balanced. Margaret didn't fare any better. Without her daughter's income and with her reputation in tatters, she began losing everything she had fought to hold on to. Rumors of foreclosure spread quickly. A neighbor of hers, someone who used to brag about Margaret's impeccable taste, called me one afternoon to say she'd seen moving trucks outside the Shaw house. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Margaret had spent her life chasing control, and now control was what had abandoned her. I thought of David often in those weeks. His letter had done what he'd hoped it had brought truth to light, but it had also stripped away years of illusion. Sometimes late at night, I'd sit by the window and think about how simple it all could have been if kindness hadn't been mistaken for weakness or pride for strength. Mark came to see me not long after the article broke. He looked tired, older somehow, as though the weight of all that had happened had pressed down on him until he finally saw clearly. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he'd eaten countless childhood breakfasts. "I should have known," he said quietly. "You were trying to protect us, and I didn't want to see it." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. You wanted to believe the best in the people you love. That's not a mistake, Mark. That's hope. He swallowed hard and nodded. Emily's a mess. She's not sleeping. She won't talk to anyone but Mom, and even she's barely holding on. She'll have to face it, I said gently. We all do sooner or later. Mark's eyes softened, and for the first time in months, there was no distance between us. He exhaled slowly, like someone releasing something heavy. I'm staying here for a while if that's okay, he said. Of course it is, I answered. And in that small moment, I felt something begin to heal. Days passed quiet and steady. The garden bloomed early that spring, as if untouched by the chaos that had swallowed everything else. I spent most mornings outside trimming the roses, feeling the earth beneath my hands. Life in its own quiet way kept moving forward. It was late one evening when I heard a knock at the door. Not hurried, not angry this time. Just tentative. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the entryway. Through the frosted glass, I could see a shadow, small, trembling. When I opened the door, she was standing there. Emily. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, her hair undone. The confident poise she always carried was gone. She looked younger somehow, fragile, in a way I'd never seen before. Her voice broke when she spoke. Please, she whispered. Let me in. For a moment, I only looked at her. The night air was cold, brushing against our faces like a quiet witness. Her shoulders shook and her eyes were red. The mascara streaked down her cheeks in uneven lines. I thought of the young woman she once was, the bright smile, the way she used to call me Mom, without hesitation, and then of all the walls she had built between us. Pride had made her shine for strangers and turn cold toward those who loved her. Now that shine was gone, and all that was left was a young woman who had finally run out of places to hide. I stepped aside without a word and gestured for her to come in. She hesitated, as if unsure she was welcome, then crossed the threshold quietly. The house was dim, lit only by the soft glow from the kitchen lamp. She stood there, wringing her hands, her breath unsteady. Sit down, I said gently. She did. I walked to the counter, fetched a box of tissues, and set it in front of her. She looked up at me, expecting, I don't know, a hug, maybe words of comfort. But I gave her neither. I had learned that forgiveness is not a gift to be handed out in haste. It's a door that only opens when both sides are ready to walk through it. She took a tissue, her hands trembling. I don't know where to start, she said. Everything's gone. The house, the brand deals the money. Mom won't talk to me. She blames me for everything. I sat across from her, folding my hands in my lap. And what do you think? Her eyes filled again. I think she's right. I was stupid. I wanted so badly to prove myself that I didn't care who I hurt. I used your son's company like it was mine, and when it all fell apart, I tried to blame you. You didn't deserve that. I listened quietly. Her words came haltingly, like a confession she'd rehearsed 100 times but still couldn't say easily. She looked at me, searching for something, mercy perhaps, but I didn't give her what she wanted. I gave her honesty instead. You were lost, I said softly. And when people lose themselves, they cling to whatever makes them feel powerful. But power built on pride never lasts. She nodded, biting her lip. I hurt Mark too. He won't even look at me. He will, I said, though I wasn't sure if it was true. But not yet. Healing takes time. The front door opened then, and Mark stepped inside. He froze when he saw her surprise flickering across his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily stood up, her voice trembling. Mark! I'm sorry, she whispered. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to hear it. He looked at her for a long moment before his eyes shifted to me. Mom, he said quietly. Can I talk to you? Emily nodded understanding and stepped aside. Mark and I moved to the living room, where the faint smell of the tea I'd brewed earlier still lingered. He rubbed his hands together the way he used to when he was nervous as a boy. I owe you an apology too, he said finally. You tried to warn me and I didn't want to see it. I thought you were being overprotective, maybe even jealous. I didn't want to believe that Emily or Mom Shaw could do the things they did. But I was wrong. I was blind. I reached out, touching his arm gently. You loved them, I said. You wanted to believe in them. That's not blindness, Mark. That's love. He shook his head. It's more than that. I let my pride get in the way. I wanted to build something on my own to make you proud. And when I failed, I blamed everyone but myself. I smiled faintly. You don't have to make me proud, Mark. You already did the moment you learned to take responsibility for what's yours. Sometimes, love means letting people fall even when it breaks your heart to watch. He looked down, his eyes glistening. You're too good to us, Mom. No, I said softly. I just learned that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And wisdom comes from surviving enough storms to know which ones are worth standing in. He leaned in, resting his forehead against mine for just a moment, the way he did when he was a child. It was a small gesture, but it carried years of unspoken understanding. I felt the tension leave him, replaced by something lighter. We sat there for a while in silence, the three of us connected, not by perfection, but by the fragile thread of truth that had finally stitched us back together. Emily sat quietly on the couch, wiping her tears, her voice small when she finally spoke. I don't deserve your kindness. I met her gaze. Maybe not yet, I said gently, but everyone deserves a chance to earn it. The clock ticked softly in the background. Outside, the night was calm, the kind of stillness that follows a long storm. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace settle over the house like a blanket. Then, just as the quiet began to feel safe again, there was a knock at the door. I stood puzzled and went to answer it. On the porch sat a small white envelope, no return address, just my name written neatly across the front. I opened it slowly. Inside were 2 airline tickets, Paris. The city of dreams, the one I had once whispered about, the one Emily had flaunted, the one David and I had never reached together. My breath caught as I looked at the dates. They were for next week. I held the tickets in my hands, tracing the embossed letters as if they might fade if I blinked too long. Paris. A place I had once only whispered about to David in the quiet hours of our youth when we had nothing but dreams and time. He had promised we'd go one day after Mark finished college, after the business stabilized, after life stopped getting in the way. But time has a way of stealing after. I had long accepted that Paris would remain a dream, buried under the weight of responsibilities. And yet, here it was, an invitation from fate itself, unexpected and perfectly timed. When Mark walked into the kitchen, I showed him the envelope. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both surprise and something softer gratitude, maybe, or peace. Paris, he said quietly. You and Dad always talked about it. I nodded. Yes, it's time we go. He hesitated. You mean... Together, I looked at him, my son who had aged more in the past few months than in all the years before. Yes, I said simply. It's time we both see what he wanted us to see. And so we went. The flight was long but peaceful. I watched the clouds drift past the window, soft and white, against the endless blue, and thought of David. I imagined him beside me, resting his hand over mine the way he always did when he wanted to remind me that silence could be love too. Somewhere between the hours, I realized that I wasn't chasing closure anymore. I was honoring memory. There's a difference. When we arrived in Paris, the air carried a kind of sweetness I'd never felt before. The city seemed alive with light, even in the gray of morning. Mark and I spent the first day walking along the Seine, our steps unhurried, our conversation easy. For the first time, there was no tension between us, just quiet understanding. Over dinner that evening, in a small cafe tucked away on a cobblestone street, Mark raised his glass to me. "To Dad," he said. I lifted mine. "To truth," I added. We clinked glasses, and I saw something settle in his eyes, a kind of acceptance that only comes when all the pieces of one's past finally fit together. Later that night, as we stood near the Eiffel Tower, watching its lights flicker against the dark sky, he said softly, "I keep thinking about everything that happened, about Emily, about Mom Shaw. Do you ever regret how it all turned out?" I took a deep breath, feeling the chill of the evening against my skin. "No," I said, "because I didn't destroy them, Mark. They destroyed themselves. Pride did what I never could. It always does." He nodded slowly, his gaze following the lights that shimmered across the river. I could tell he understood. He didn't need revenge anymore, and neither did I. Justice had already done its work not through cruelty, but through truth. That was enough. In the days that followed, we visited the places David once described to me in letters: the Louvre, Montmartre, the gardens of Versailles. Everywhere I went, I felt him there. Sometimes in the way the sunlight caught the edge of a building, sometimes in the scent of roses blooming along the path. Love doesn't end, I realized. It simply changes its shape. Back home, news traveled differently. Word spread that Emily and Margaret were living quietly now in a small town upstate. Their house had been sold to pay off debts. Emily had deleted her accounts, her once glittering world gone silent. Margaret, once so proud, was said to spend most days indoors, rarely seen. I didn't feel joy at their downfall, only a deep, weary empathy. The world had finally caught up to the lies they'd built, and I knew too well how heavy truth could be when it finally arrived. On our last evening in Paris, Mark and I sat at a small cafe near our hotel, the glow of the city stretching out before us. He reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what I asked. For not giving up on me," he said. "For teaching me that love isn't about saving people. It's about standing by them when they finally decide to save themselves." I squeezed his hand gently. "That's what your father believed, too." The next morning, as we packed our bags, I found another envelope slipped beneath the hotel door. No name, no return address, just a neat, familiar handwriting on the front. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and an invitation embossed in gold. It was from the local business association back home. They were hosting an award ceremony in honor of integrity and community service. At the bottom in bold letters, I saw my name. Evelyn Harris, recipient of the Lifetime Stewardship Award. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the letter in my hands as the morning light filled the room. For the first time in years, I felt completely still. Not waiting, not grieving, just existing in the quiet certainty that everything had found its place. Justice, love, peace, all of it finally home. The week passed in a blur of quiet gratitude. The ceremony was held in a grand hall near the Seine, its tall windows draped in soft gold light. When I arrived, Mark walked beside me, his hand steady on my arm. The evening felt surreal, not because of the honor, but because of how calm I felt inside. For so many years, I'd imagined justice as something fierce, a force that demanded to be seen. But sitting there among strangers who spoke kindly of courage and integrity, I realized that justice could be gentle too, like the steady beat of a heart that never gave up. When my name was called, I stood slowly. The applause felt distant, not loud or triumphant, but respectful, a quiet recognition. I accepted the award with a simple nod, the weight of it light compared to the journey that had brought me there. The presenter spoke of strength of quiet conviction, of the power of truth that doesn't need to shout. I thought of David then, of his voice, his kindness, and the letter he'd written that saved us all. After the ceremony, Mark and I walked to the river. The Eiffel Tower glowed in the distance, its lights flickering like a heartbeat against the night sky. I stood for a long time watching it, the cool air brushing against my face, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Grief had taught me patience. Betrayal had taught me strength. But forgiveness, I realized, had taught me balance. The world didn't need to see me win. It only needed to know I had survived with my heart still intact. As the lights shimmered above, I whispered the truth. I had learned too late, and yet just in time. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, like peace after a storm. Soft music drifted from a nearby cafe. Mark smiled at me, and I smiled back, the city reflecting in his eyes. I looked up once more at the tower, the light, the night, and the memory of love that still lived in every corner of my soul. And that's enough. And as the final notes of that evening fade, I hope you felt the weight and warmth of Evelyn's journey, the quiet strength, the justice that spoke without raising its voice, and the reminder that peace is its own kind of victory. Stories like hers aren't just about revenge or redemption. They're about finding grace when the world gives you every reason to harden your heart. They're about knowing that sometimes the best answer to cruelty is calm, and the greatest triumph is peace. If this story touched you, if you saw a part of yourself in Evelyn's courage or in her quiet forgiveness, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in her place? Do you believe justice can truly be gentle? Share your feelings in the comments below. I read every one of them. Your reflections help these stories live beyond the screen. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about family love loss, and the kind of strength that grows with time, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. Every week, we bring you new journeys that remind us that life, even in its hardest moments, always finds a way back to light. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for feeling this story with me. Until next time, take care of your heart. Cherish your peace, and remember, the quiet truth is often the one that lasts the longest.